So I'm Mark Morowczynski. I am a principal program manager at Microsoft. Boo, hiss, break his legs, right? We all hate Microsoft. And when I submitted this talk, I knew that I would be able to get at least 5 things about Azure AD for you, but I actually was able to sneak more in. So who am I? So I'm in the Identity Product Group. We are responsible for Active Directory, Active Directory Federation Services, and Azure Active Directory. And I am on the customer experience team. We work with customers, both large and complex, of their deployments of Azure Active Directory. And we provide guidance, we get feedback about the deployments, and we kind of work that into the product. So after the talk today, if you have feedback about Azure Active Directory stuff, specifically logs, come see me afterwards, or Danya, who's also on the Azure Active Directory team. Before that, I was a premier field engineer. Has anyone worked with a PFE before at Microsoft? So I did a lot of AD health checks, client performance stuff, as well as like phone call in the middle of the night, how fast can you get to this city? Nobody can log in. I have a lot of stories. See me after. As well as actually I'm a SANS STI student. I've been doing that for the last year. It's actually been really great. I'm happy to talk more about that after the session. So how many people have Azure Active Directory today? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, how many people have Office 365? Okay, first tip. If you have Office 365, you have Azure Active Directory. Okay? You can't have one without the other. And it's a little confusing, I get that. One time at a conference, someone came up to me and said, how many domain controllers do I need in Azure to run Azure Active Directory? Okay? I like where his head's at, right? You know, I have Active Directory, I have domain controllers, I'm going to have Azure Active Directory. How many of those do I need in Azure? I told him I have good news and bad news. The good news is it's 0. The bad news is you have a lot to read, because Azure Active Directory is an identity as a service platform, and there's a lot going on in it. Okay? Again, I'm happy to talk about anything specifically about Azure Active Directory afterwards, but we're going to focus on this little part right here about the logs today, okay? So there's 3 parts of this talk. I'm going to explain what's in the Azure AD logs today and like where do you get those. How do you integrate them with your SIEM tool? And then finally, what are the events that you should be looking for in that? So Azure AD logs is made up of 2 types of logs. The first one is going to be the sign-in logs, which is pretty much interactive logins to the platform, like signing into Exchange Online, Salesforce, AWS, something like that. And then we have audit logs, which is pretty much everything else, anything that changes the state of the directory. And to get to these, in the portal.azure, you click under monitoring, and you will see sign-ins and audit logs. Okay? So what's actually in these sign-in logs is a few things. Again, like I said, you'll see application success and failures, like logging into Exchange Online. You're going to see who did it, the display name, the UPN, as well as some session conditions like location, date and time, and IP. Basically, it's everything you'd expect to be in a log. And this is the default view in which most people kind of assume that's the only thing that are in the Azure AD sign-in logs, but there's actually a bunch more things you can get out of it. There's actually MFA info, so you can see that was MFA required for this sign-in event? Which method of MFA did they use? Was it phone call, text, or Authenticator app? How many people here are using the Authenticator app? Okay, that's far few, too many. But come see me after. I have some laptop stickers of the Authenticator app for you. Come see me after. And then you can see the result of this. Like, was MFA successfully completed? Did they not have to do it because they already had an MFA token? You can see all that in the logs today. Client conditions. We actually show you the device ID. If you have hybrid Azure AD join the device or Azure AD join the device, you can see that, as well as the browser and the OS from the user agent string. And then conditional access. How many people are using conditional access today in Azure AD? A few people. Okay, so conditional access is a great feature. It lets you set conditions, and then that's how you grant access to resources. And it can be pretty straightforward as well as very complicated when you have a bunch of conditional access policies together. So you can see in the logs which conditional access policies were applied to that sign-in, what were the controls required, and then what was the result of this. This is super helpful for troubleshooting when you have lots of CA policies. Correlation ID, okay? When your end users have some sort of issue or an error, and then they have like an error page, tucked away in the lower corner is the correlation ID of that sign-in event. It's usually not captured by the end user, and the help desk doesn't know to get it, So when the ticket comes to you on the back end or the identity guys and they have to figure out what happened, they have to go get a repro. You don't have to do that. The correlation ID is now in the sign-in logs, which you can get, like just pull it out, and when you call support, that's the correlation ID you'll give them to help you troubleshoot the issue. So that's super, super helpful. And lastly, the latency we say is about 5 to 10 minutes for these sign-in logs. Realistically, though, you'll probably see it closer to a minute. And to get to these logs, in the sign-in log section, there's 2 things I want to point out. Export data settings, which I'll get to in a second, and this columns tab. When you click this columns tab, you can see all the different things I just talked about. But by default, only the first 4 or 5 are actually checked. So you can go in there and check all those boxes. Some key things to know. So the first thing requires an understanding of tokens in Azure AD, which is kind of complicated. So I'm going to play a little fast and loose with this. So there's a thing called an access token. That's good for 1 hour, and that grants you access to a resource. Okay? Then there's a thing called a session token, which ties a user to a browser. And when the access token expires, the session token is used to get you another access token. Okay? And there's a third type of token called the refresh token. The refresh token ties a user to an application like Outlook or Outlook Mobile. And the refresh token, again, is used to get you more access tokens. Everybody with me so far? That's like tokens in like 90 seconds. So the thing that you need to know in the sign-in logs today is that only the initial authentication of that refresh token actually shows up. This is both good and bad. It's good because there's going to be a lot of refresh tokens requesting more access tokens, and it's very, very noisy, and you usually don't want to see that. But it's bad because when you want to see it, you need to go see it. So we have a feature coming in Azure Active Directory where you will be able to see these initial more refresh tokens. Okay? Another thing to know, only successful federated logins are going to be displayed in Azure AD. So who's here is federated with Office 365? So when I say Azure AD, Office 365, that's like kind of interchangeably. So who's using like ADFS, Ping Federate, SiteMinder, something like that? A few people, okay? So this makes sense when you think about it, but you usually don't end up thinking about it until it's too late. So today, when you go to log in to Azure AD or Office 365, you get redirected to this IDP like ADFS. And the user puts their username and password in. If it's correct, ADFS sends a claim up to Azure AD that says this person is who they say they are, here's their login info, and they get signed into Azure AD. Same thing, when it's a bad login, we redirect you down to the IDP. The IDP needs to authenticate you. The user puts the wrong username and password in, and they fail the login. Azure Active Directory will never know that because we never get a claim back, right? Okay, so it makes sense. But when you are under some sort of a password spray attack in a federated model, all of your failure events are going to be on your federated IDP. So you need to make sure you're capturing these logs from your federated IDP today because they're probably going to wrap pretty quickly, especially if you have a large environment. Okay? So that's a big, big thing that customers don't always know about. Okay. Audit logs. Azure AD audit logs are anything that changes the state of a resource. So that's going to be things like password reset. A user completes password reset registration, or they actually complete an actual password reset. That's going to show up in these logs. Privileged identity management is a feature we have where you have no standing admin access, so you have to elevate to be able to be like a global admin or something like that. Any of those elevations are going to show up in the audit log. Terms of use is exactly what you think it is. So you see if someone's accepted terms of use or declined terms of use. B2B, we have a feature where you can collaborate with other companies and share documents and all kinds of amazing, great stuff. When you invite a user, when they accept it, that will show up in the logs as well. And then Azure AD does SaaS apps, lots and lots of SaaS apps. So anytime you do configuration of a SaaS app, like the sign-in URL, the reply URL, those show up in these audit logs as well as provisioning to these SaaS apps. Okay? And timing-wise, we say it's about 10 to 15 minutes, but generally you'll see it faster than 5 minutes about. Okay? And to look at these logs here, in the logs you can sort by category, and you can pick whichever thing you're looking for there. Okay. The other area is some Azure AD security logs, and this is kind of broken into a few different buckets. So the first one is we do user risk, which is the aggregate risk score of that user. And you can either have no risk, have low risk, medium, or high. And again, that's the aggregate of the user. And then we have risky events and risky sign-ins. So some risky events are like leaked credentials, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Logging in from an anonymous IP like a Tor browser, we'll flag that as a risky sign-in. Impossible travel, right? If I log in from here in Phoenix and I go log in from Seattle in 20 minutes, that's not possible, we'll flag that. And we also flag things that we've never seen you log in from something before. And all those events combine into getting the aggregate risk score for that user. And then lastly, we also have a vulnerability section if you have Azure AD Premium 2, which talks about, it will show you users that aren't registered for MFA, as well as if you granted somebody, like, does anyone have it where like somebody has to have an admin role? Even like though you know they're never gonna use it, right? So we'll show you, hey, this person has admin permissions and they've not actually used it for anything in the last 30 days, okay? So depending on what license you have, if you have Azure AD Premium 1 or EMS E3, you'll see this top box here. You'll see our users flagged for risk and these risky sign-ins. If you have Azure AD Premium 2, we have a feature called Identity Protection. You see the users flagged for risk, the risk events, and the vulnerabilities. Okay, so who can see these logs? Your global administrator, right? This is like your enterprise admin. We also have a security administrator role, security reader role that can see some of the security events, and then your reports reader, which is a new role just for looking at the reports. But the big thing that you guys need to know is there's no difference in the data scope that they see. So you do not need to be a global admin to see all the logs. The reports reader can see all the same stuff in the reports that they have access to. So you don't need to give people global admin. Please, please don't give people global admin. And then all of your users can access their own sign-in logs in the My Apps portal and see their sign-in events. Okay, so how do we get these logs into a SIEM tool? So back in the day, previous to September 2018 and this year and earlier, the only way to programmatically get logs into Azure AD was doing Graph API calls. So you could either do this via maybe your SIEM tool would have like a way to do a graph call and it pulls it down as to a JSON text document and it can parse it, or maybe your SIEM tool couldn't do that, so you had to write a PowerShell script and you had to pull these logs down and they would come down as a JSON text file again, and then your SIEM would have to ingest these logs into your SIEM and kind of like correlate them and do all that kind of stuff. So if you're saying to yourself right now, Microsoft, I think you might have screwed this one up. This sounds like a giant pain in the ass. You would be right. This was super problematic for a lot of our customers. So things like you have to enumerate multiple endpoints to get all the logs. So to get the sign-in logs, that's an endpoint. To get the audit logs, that's a different endpoint. To get all those security events, you better believe that's a different endpoint, okay? Super painful. Secondly, depending on how often your script was running, you might be pulling down duplicate events from the portal, right? And then you'd have to either dedupe them in the script, or your SIEM would have to be able to handle this, and it was super, super painful. And the last part, which is the worst part, you have to have a service principal to authenticate to pull these logs down. So in people's PowerShell scripts, they would put the shared secret of that service principal in the script. So if anyone took that script and ran it, they could pull all of your logs down. Horrible, right? So in September, we had this new thing come out called the Azure Monitor. And it's basically a unified platform for not just Azure AD, but for all of Azure. And you can get all your Azure AD logs in there, your audit logs, and your sign-in logs. And we also do some analysis of the logs for you with some machine learning stuff's built in. We have log analytics that I'll talk about in a second. And we have some workflow integrations where you can do some alerting and things like that. But more importantly, this is how you can integrate with a SIEM tool, okay? So how do you do this? It's really easy. Remember I said you're going to click on Export Settings. You're going to do New Diagnostic Setting. You're then going to give it a name and click on Stream to an Event Hub. This is the important part. You can also then select Storage Accounts. So if you want to store your logs for a longer period of time, you can keep them there, or send them to Log Analytics. And then you pick the logs that you want to send there. So this is what you're going to see when you do New Diagnostic Setting. It's really simple, right? You're going to give it a name. You're going to click Stream to an Event Hub, and then you're going to pick Audit Logs and Sign-in Logs. That's all you got to do. Okay? No more graph calls. Okay? So we've worked with a couple of our SIEM partners to do this integration so you can do it natively. Splunk's in here. Here's our documentation for that. Sumo Logic's got it done. And then QRadar is almost done. I see they have the connector built, but I think they have some parsing to do. And ArcSight is like days away from being done. I saw the documentation yesterday in preview, so it's almost ready. So if you're using a SIEM that's not up here, please tell them you want this. You guys have much, much more power than we do at Microsoft to get them to do this integration. I have lots of my customers asking for certain tools to get integrated. We're happy to work with them to do this integration. Please reach out to me afterwards or find me or Danya afterwards, and we'll help get you guys connected to the right people, and we'll get this integrated. Okay? So, astute people in the audience will have realized I talked about Signin Logs and Audit Logs, but not security events. So what's up with that? So security events actually come from their own thing called the Intelligent Security Graph, which is this giant thing where we kind of look through like all kinds of good stuff, not just Azure AD related things. So you're going to see stuff like IaaS events or PaaS events, like someone's banging away on an RDP system or something like that. So to do this integration, you're basically going to follow this URL, ak.ms/graph security SIEM. And this will walk you through the documentation on how to do this, but all you're going to do, and the slides are going to be available after, so like don't like panic, scribble right, okay? Okay. You're basically going to configure Azure Monitor to send these security events to the exact same event hub that you've configured previously. And then your SIEM will be able to suck all these events down. Okay. Quick win. I wanted to kind of throw this in there. We have this thing called the Azure AD Power BI Content Pack. Though I do think we might have some rework to do based on some of the discussions today around graphs and things like that, which was great. But is anyone a manager in here? 2 people? All right, this is manager catnip. They love this thing. It has everything a manager loves. It has charts, it has colors, it has maps, okay? So it's totally free. This is a totally free thing. It takes like 10 minutes to get set up. You can download it. It uses Power BI. It pulls your logs in. It has some pre-built templates that you guys can also manipulate, but it kind of gives you some basic stuff about your tenant. Okay? All right, so now that, log analytics, last thing. So log analytics is this new platform we have. It's a central platform for not just, again, Azure AD, it's for all of Azure. All the logs from different parts of Azure are going to come into this platform. And it has some built-in machine learning algorithms, as well as some anomaly detection. And you can, as the admin, you guys can run your own queries natively in the browser in the Azure portal, and you can make some custom alerts and actions and things like that. So just to kind of give you an idea here, we're querying for audit logs, and we're going to sort by like total, and you can see here that account provisioning events is the largest amount of events, so we're probably provisioning to a SaaS app like Salesforce or ServiceNow or something like that. And then you can use that, and you can build dashboards again. So we can see here, we were provisioning to Box and Salesforce and all this kind of stuff. So you can build all this log analytics platform. I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I figured you guys probably already have SIEM tools that you're already probably leveraging and using, but I want to kind of make you guys aware of this, that this exists. And this is new from September. You know it's in the logs. You've got to integrate it in your SIEM, so what are the events that you should be looking for in this? So the first thing is legacy authentication, that you need to deal with this immediately. If you do one thing from my talk, go back and deal with legacy authentication, because we saw in August 200,000 accounts fell to password spray attacks. So for password spray, if you're not familiar, we take the same password, I don't know, December 2018 exclamation point, seems like a good one for this month, and we run it across everyone in the directory. And we know that about 1% of users are going to fall to this attack. Okay? So in August 2018, we saw 200,000 accounts compromised due to password spray, and almost 100% of these password spray attacks are coming from legacy authentication. Okay? You can block legacy authentication in Azure AD. It is a conditional access policy. It's super helpful, and we find that it reduces compromise rate for customers by 66%. So this is a huge, huge win. And password spray is a little bit complicated depending on your environment. So we have this really good blog post that talks through the things you should do about this. Remember I said for sign-ins, Azure AD only sees the successful sign-ins if you're federated. So if you are federated, you are responsible for dealing with password spray. Okay? If you're using pass-through authentication, or I'm sorry, if you're using password hash sync or authenticating directly against Azure AD, we do some protections for you. But if you are federated, you have to handle this yourself. ADFS 2016 has a thing called Smart Lockout that will help with this, but please go back and read this. You might not even realize it if you're not looking for it today. Okay, so what are some examples of legacy authentication? So we really call this like basic authentication. This is going to be kind of your older clients, right? So when you do authentication, the big thing here is you should be doing MFA for all of your stuff. I think like we all have agreement on that, I hope. So these clients cannot do MFA, right? Because they post this username and password to Exchange or something like that, and when we send back to them, you have to do MFA, the client has no way to respond to that, does not know what to do, okay? So what you want to see in your mail clients is you want like the mini web browser. So what I'm talking about? We call that modern authentication in all of our documentation. So you want to get rid of legacy authentication as much as you can. So some clients that do this, if you're on Office 2010 or older, you're doing basic authentication or legacy authentication. There's nothing you can do about this except for upgrade, okay? That's all you can do. Start upgrading now if you're already, is anyone on Office 2010? Doesn't want to raise their hand? Okay. Like someone sending an email furiously on their Office 2010 client, right? Okay, Office 2013. By default, it's doing basic authentication. You can turn on modern authentication with a registry key. And then clients that are using older mail protocols, like they're doing POP3, IMAP, SMTP, anything like that. So to kind of give you guys some examples, like visuals, if you see this, Windows 7, this is a basic auth dialog prompt. This is bad. You want to be on modern auth. This is what it looks like in Windows 10. Does it look familiar to anybody? Like remember, I said you want to see the modern auth. You want the like the little mini browser window, right? That's what you want to see in the client. Does anyone know what this is? Pine? I just gave old man Conrad like a flashback. Like he was like, oh! He's logging into his BBS system right now. Okay. Okay, so during this, every single weird old mail client in your environment is going to show its ugly head. You're going to find people that have like, oh, I have to use Thunderbird 3.4.1, and I can't possibly think about changing, and all that kind of stuff. That's all going to come out. That all has to get fixed. You're going to find your executives that use the Mac Mail client on OS 10. That does basic auth. Apple would need to update their client to do that. On iOS, the native mail client from iOS 11 and greater does modern authentication, which is what you want, but OS 10, the native client does basic auth. Also in my experience, you are going to find, like Macs tend to be like less managed than like a Windows machine in an environment. So all of like the old ass Office clients on Macs are going to be in here. Like you might find someone that has like Entourage. You remember that thing? Not the show, the client, right? So all that's got to get moved to Outlook 2016 to do modern auth, okay? And it's not just the end users that are problematic. If you're using any older PowerShell modules to manage your tenant, this dialog box might look familiar to you. Does it look familiar to anybody? Is anyone still using it? If you're still using that, that is bad, okay? I know someone in here is. I totally know someone is. Like, you act like you're not. Someone is. Because this means you're not doing MFA for your admin accounts, which is terrible. So does anyone know the percentage of admin accounts that have MFA enabled? Shout it out. What do you think? 5%. I wish it was 5%. Yeah. So September of last year, we had Ignite, we talked about it, and the number was at 0.7. Yeah, 0.7. Another heart attack for old man Conrad back there on that one. 0.7. So we made a huge deal about it. We're like, you got to do this, all this stuff. So this year, we are at 1.7. So it's good. We more than doubled. We moved a percent. That's really good, except for it's still really bad because it's 1.7. So if you see anyone doing this, this is bad. They need to be on a modern authentication. PowerShell modules, they've all been updated. If anyone tells you they can't, they're lying. We have updated commandlets for all the stuff that do modern authentication. Okay? All right, how do you find it? in your Signin Logs, you are going to look for, you can change the client app field here, right? And you can do a drop-down. You can see all the different protocols we're using to do sign-ins. So if you see anything with POP, IMAP, MAPI, SMTP, that's all going directly to Exchange Online, as well as ActiveSync, which is like a whole other can of worms. But this is where you're going to start doing this. Look for this. Start dealing with these clients as fast as you can, okay? Then there's a thing called Other Clients, which is SharePoint and Exchange Web Services. This one's a fun one. Because Exchange Web Services means somebody wrote some sort of like middleware tier app that's like sending mail on behalf of some app or somebody or whatever. That either needs to get quarantined in like conditional access like immediately so we can protect it, but it's probably going to need to be rewritten to use modern authentication protocols, okay? Okay, so some key security events that you need to take action on. Any high-risk user, you have to take action on because, like I said earlier, it can be low or no risk, low, medium, and high, and it also corresponds to how confident we are that that account is compromised, okay? So one of the ways to get a user at high risk is to have a leaked credential, okay? So the way we find that is if you have password hash sync enabled in your tenant, you should do this. Please go back and do this. And we take that on-prem hash, we run it through SHA-256 1,000 times with per user salt, and that gets synced up to Azure AD, okay? And you can still be federated with password hash sync on, and you actually probably want to do that. I'll talk about that in a second. But we look for clear text, username, and passwords. We take those passwords, and we run them through the same hashing algorithm as the on-prem AD hashes. And if the hashes match, that means what? That's the same password, right? That's really, really bad, okay? So one of my customers had this on, because they listened to me, like one of my customers that actually listens to me, and they had 4 leaked credentials in one office in Brazil. And they're like, that's kind of suspicious. And they went and looked. And one of those accounts was a service account. So that was even more suspicious. So they did their incident handling, they got their act together, they go down there, knock it out. All right, problem solved. We got it. Great. 4 months later, same office, same 4 accounts showed up. And they had none of their other tools picked up any of this stuff. It was the leak credential report, okay? So that's the first reason why you want to have password hash sync on. The second reason is if something catastrophic happens to your environment, kind of like the NotPetya stuff that Eric talked about this morning, which happened to customers, you can flip your authentication to be against Azure AD directly. And it's important for 2 things. First of all, your end users can continue to work. They're going to use the same credentials to log in against Azure AD. Any SaaS apps you have up there are all going to continue to work. Office 365 will still work. But more importantly, the IT people will have corporate resources to start bringing the environment back. Because if you don't have that, it is like crisis, right? So it's like anything goes. Like all those rules like out the window, right? So it means personal email is going to have like server names, IP addresses, accounts, and probably password in people's Gmail, Hotmail, Comcast, Yahoo Mail, you name it. Because it's crisis, and we got to get a hold of people, right? So if you have password hash sync on, you can flip your authentication to be that, okay? Medium risks. So any Tor browser logins are probably going to be suspicious. You should not be using Tor to check your email, though what you'll probably find is that if you have an international audience, people like to use like VPN anonymizers to like watch US Netflix, and then they forget, and then like they log into their mail and it will pop up here. But we can challenge all these things for MFA if you see that. So please look for these. These are probably malicious or accidents. Second thing, unfamiliar locations. If we've never seen you log in from somewhere before, we alert on that. We can MFA challenge that. If they pass MFA challenge, all is good. But if you see a bunch of failed MFA challenges in the Signin Logs from unfamiliar locations, that's probably bad. Suspicious IPs. So at the cloud scale, right, we can see when an IP is just like banging away on different tenants, like fail, 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 and they get to your tenant and they successfully log in. That's probably not good. So if you see anything in the suspicious IPs, you should go take action on that immediately. And like I said, there's no like two mediums don't equal a high in terms of the risk. It's much more complicated, but again, the risk events and the severity score is how confident we are also in the signal itself. Okay, so audit events to take action on. This is where you're gonna find like your traditional, probably the logging events you've been looking for in Active Directory for the most part. So anyone that promotions of accounts to admin accounts that are not supposed to happen, that's bad. Accounts that look like service accounts or high-value targets, right, that's bad. Changing to service principals, that's probably bad. But here's what I want to spend a little more time on. Consent grant made by admins. So depending on the application, when you add it to Azure Active Directory, you have to grant it permissions to the directory, depending on the permissions it's asking. Think about like your mobile phone, right? When it says, hey, can I access your address book and things like that? But some apps, because they're shittily written or malicious, will ask for lots of stuff, okay, that only the admin can grant. So we don't see this a lot today in our attacks, but if I was a bad guy and I got global admin access, I would add an app that I control that has lots of permissions in the directory, right? And then once you figure this out and you boot me, my app, that maybe I named it like, I don't know, they have Salesforce, and they have Salesforce Test, Salesforce Test 2. Let's stick that in there. They have 5,000 apps. They're never going to find me. Stick it in there. So in your audit logs, anytime you see a consent grant made by administrative privileges, you better make sure you know exactly what that app is doing and why it needs those types of permissions. Okay? Removal of MFA, that's probably bad. And then any changing of audit configuration in the tenant, right? Again, this is like your basic AD stuff. Like they compress the audit logs down or delete stuff, like that's all bad. Okay, so I thought most of you would have Office 365, so I kind of pulled a couple things for this as well. Anytime someone creates mail forwarding rules to an external domain or a transport rule, that's probably gonna be bad. One of my customers, someone got phished, some money went missing, all that kind of good stuff. There was mailbox rules, right, to send all those types of mails to an external domain and then move everything to deleted items so no one could see it, right? So anytime you see that, that's probably bad. Same thing here with like mailbox delegation or any mail forwarding rules on the mailbox that are not supposed to be there. You want to probably audit those as well. And then last one here is changes to external sharing policy. SharePoint, you can do lots of awesome stuff to collaborate with other business partners. And there's lots of knobs you can turn inside there. One of those knobs you can turn is say, nobody has to authenticate to read this document or file or it's a SharePoint site. There's really good reasons you need to do that. There's also a lot of bad reasons, right? So if someone went in there and changed your sharing policies, that would be really bad, okay? So there's a lot more that you can do in Office 365. There's an amazing blog post by the Office 365 team that I've linked to here. Go read that. Make sure you have all of the auditing turned on in Office 365, and they kind of walk you through all the events that you should be trying to capture and look for in your session, okay? So that's everything I had. I have about 1 minute and 30 seconds left. I have one thing I want to add. So earlier we were talking about how it's hard to find your Azure resources. I'm going to give you a URL. It's not in my deck, but you can go to this URL. And trust me, I know it's going to sound weird, but it's totally true, okay? Go to aka.ms/magic button, right? And what that will do, there's a little thing you can toggle that basically says any Azure subscription that is using your Azure AD tenant is now visible to the global admin, okay? This is super helpful. I have customers tell me like, we run a tight ship. There's like 4 Azure subscriptions. I'm like, let's turn this button on. Turn the button on, they had 200. They lost their mind, They had someone that wrote a service called ShipBot that was like 40,000 Azure credits a month. It was just rolling through, no one knew about it. So aka.ms/magic button. That's my email, and that's me on Twitter. I'll be here all this afternoon, or tonight and tomorrow. Please, if you have feedback about Azure AD or things you want to know about it, I'm happy to talk to anyone about Azure AD. We have Danya here as well from the Azure AD product group as well that can help. All right, thanks everybody.